Eleanor Marsh was 76 years old and had exactly one final wish. She'd known for weeks that she was dying. Stage 4, the oncologist had said, matter-of-factly, the way doctors do when the mathematics have already been settled. She'd arranged what she could, said what needed saying, made peace with most of it. The one thing she hadn't made peace with was being separated from George, even in death. They'd bought the double plot together in 1987, the same spring they'd paid off their mortgage. She was going to lie down beside her husband of 51 years, and that was simply that. Then the cemetery called. 3 days before she died, a soft-spoken administrator named Carol Hensley told Eleanor there was something in their files that couldn't wait any longer. A sealed envelope, left by George himself 12 years ago, when he was still alive and already dying, with a single instruction written on the outside. Do not deliver this until Eleanor calls about coming to join him. He'd known she would call. He'd been waiting all that time. What Eleanor found inside that envelope quietly destroyed the story she'd believed about her own family for over a decade. It was a letter in George's handwriting. 3 pages, no preamble, no softening, straight to the center of it. George had discovered something in the winter before his diagnosis. Something about the person she trusted most after him. Something that had been happening for years without her knowing, quietly, in small amounts, in the shadows of the life she thought she understood. And then he told her exactly what he had done about it. In the 3 days that remained to her, Eleanor Marsh changed her will, confronted the truth she hadn't known she was living inside, and finally understood what her husband had spent 12 years quietly building. Not just a grave beside his own, but something far more powerful, a protection, a hidden fortress. A love letter written entirely in deeds and documents and careful silence. This is the story of what happens when a man who couldn't say everything out loud said all of it anyway. You're here for a reason. Together, we'll reveal what someone tried to hide. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment wherever you're watching. The folder on Eleanor's kitchen table had been sitting there for 11 days. Manila envelope, slightly bent at the corner, labeled in her own handwriting. Things to handle. Inside were 3 documents. A letter to her attorney, a draft of her updated will that wasn't finished, and a printout from the oncologist's office dated the 17th of March, confirming what Dr. Harmon had told her in person 2 weeks earlier. Stage 4, spread to the liver. Months, not years. And toward the lower end of that estimate. Eleanor Marsh was 76 years old. She'd been a widow for 12 years, a mother for 51, a grandmother for 19, and a woman with a plan for most of her adult life. The plan had always included one final detail. She would be buried next to George in Riverside Memorial, in the double plot they'd purchased together in 1987, the same spring they'd paid off the mortgage on this house. George had insisted on buying the plots that year, standing in the cemetery administrator's office in his good Sunday jacket, writing the check like it was just another practical thing to get done. You plan for the things that matter, he'd said on the drive home, squeezing her hand at a red light. She'd laughed and called him morbid. Now, 12 years after his death, she understood. The house was a small 2-story on Clement Avenue in Dayton, Ohio. 3 bedrooms, a kitchen with original tile from 1962, a backyard that had once grown tomatoes and now mostly grew weeds. George and Eleanor had moved in as newlyweds. They'd painted every room themselves. They'd raised 3 children in those rooms. Thomas, now 53, Karen, 49, and Philip, 47. All 3 lived within 40 minutes of the house. All 3 had been calling more frequently since March. Thomas called every other day. He was the oldest, the one who'd always been most comfortable talking about money. Since Eleanor's diagnosis, the calls had started to include careful questions. Mom, have you thought about the house? Mom, have you talked to your attorney? Mom, just so we're prepared, do you know where the account statements are? Thomas held Eleanor's financial power of attorney, an arrangement she'd set up 6 years ago after a minor stroke that had scared everyone and left no lasting damage. She trusted him without question. He was her firstborn. That was what mothers did. Karen called less about money and more about arrangements, hospice options. whether Eleanor wanted to die at home or in a facility. Karen meant well. Eleanor genuinely believed that, but there was a quality to those conversations that felt like stage management, a problem to be organized rather than a mother to be sat with. Philip, the youngest, called to talk. Just to talk. About nothing. About old things. About the garden and George and the summer they'd all driven to Yellowstone when the kids were young. Eleanor looked forward to Philip's calls in a way she couldn't bring herself to examine too closely, because examining it would mean admitting how she felt about the other two. The morning the cemetery called, Eleanor had been sitting at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee, reading a paperback mystery she'd already read twice before. It was the 22nd of April. Outside, the dogwood in the backyard had finally bloomed, a little late this year. She noticed the blooms every morning and felt a particular quiet gratitude for them, the way you feel grateful for things when you understand they are among the last. The call came at 9:47. The woman on the phone introduced herself as Carol Hensley, administrator at Riverside Memorial. Mrs. Marsh, I'm so sorry to disturb you. I'm reaching out about the double plot in Section C registered to George and Eleanor Marsh. I want to assure you there's no problem with your reservation. Your place is absolutely secure. But we've discovered something in our records that I believe you need to know about in person, and I think it would be better if we could meet. A pause. There's also an item that was left in our keeping for you. It's been here for quite some time. The instructions were very specific about when it should be delivered. Eleanor set down her coffee cup. What kind of item? A sealed envelope, Mrs. Marsh, left by your husband in 2012. He asked us to contact you when, and I'm reading his exact words here, when she calls about coming to join me. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a cardinal landed on the dogwood branch nearest the window, bright as a dropped penny. He knew I'd call, she said, not quite to Carol Hensley. It seems he did, yes. She drove herself to Riverside Memorial that same afternoon, despite the fact that Thomas had been calling twice a week to suggest she stop driving. The cemetery was 20 minutes from the house, a grounds she knew well. She'd visited George's grave every year on his birthday and every year on their anniversary, 58 years of Novembers and Mays. She knew which path to take from the parking lot, knew that the oak near Section C had split in a storm 3 years back and grown back stronger, knew exactly where George was. Carol Hensley was a soft-spoken woman in her 60s who met Eleanor at the administration building and walked her inside without ceremony or pity, which Eleanor appreciated more than she could say. They sat in a small office. Carol placed a white envelope on the table between them. It was sealed with packing tape aged to a faint yellow. On the front, in George's handwriting, that particular slant she'd know anywhere, the handwriting on 40 years of birthday cards and grocery lists and notes left on the counter, were 4 words. For Eleanor, not before. He came in on a Thursday, Carol said, March of 2012. He'd already been diagnosed, I believe. 6 months before he died, Eleanor said. She touched the edge of the envelope without picking it up. He told me about the diagnosis in September. He died the following March. She looked at Carol. He never mentioned coming here. He asked us to hold it in the estate file and contact you only when you reached out to us about your own arrangements. He was very clear, not a day sooner. Eleanor looked at the envelope. 12 years it had been sitting in this office, in a filing cabinet, waiting. George had been gone 12 years, and he had still managed to be patient in a way that made her chest ache. She picked it up. It was heavier than she expected. Can I? Take all the time you need, Carol said, and quietly left the room. Eleanor sat alone in the small office with George's envelope in her hands and the sound of April through the window, and for a long moment she didn't open it. She just held it. Held the weight of his handwriting, his planning, his particular stubbornness. The man who had insisted on buying burial plots in the spring of 1987 because you plan for the things that matter. 12 years after his death, and he was still, somehow, planning for her. She broke the tape carefully and opened the envelope. Inside were 2 items. The first was a folded letter, 3 pages, written in George's hand. The second was a smaller, sealed envelope marked, "For your attorney, James Whitfield only." Eleanor unfolded the letter and began to read. The letter began the way George had always begun important things, without preamble, without softening, straight to the center of it. Eleanor, if you're reading this, then the time has come, and I'm sorry I can't be there with you. I'm sorry for a lot of things I wasn't able to say out loud while I was still sitting across from you at that kitchen table. This is me trying to say them now. I need to tell you about Thomas. In the winter of 2011, about 8 months before my diagnosis, I noticed something wrong with our savings account. A withdrawal I didn't recognize. $400. I thought it was a bank error and I called to dispute it. While I was on the phone with the bank, the representative mentioned 2 other withdrawals from the previous 6 months that I'd apparently already confirmed. I hadn't confirmed anything. I started looking more carefully. Over 14 months, Eleanor, the amount came to just over $22,000. Small withdrawals, irregular enough not to trigger alerts, always from accounts Thomas had access to as our backup signer. I hired an accountant to look at everything. It took him 3 weeks. When he was finished, he sat across from me and told me I needed a lawyer. I want you to understand something before you read further. I was angry. God, I was angry. But I was also sick by then, and I knew what was coming, and I made a choice. I decided not to destroy our family in the time I had left. I decided not to tell you, because telling you would have meant watching you carry that alongside everything else. That was wrong of me. I know that now. I should have trusted you with it. Instead, I tried to handle it the only way I knew, quietly and in advance. Here is what I did. In January of 2012, with the help of James Whitfield, your attorney, whom I asked to keep this in strictest confidence until the time was right, I transferred the remaining joint savings into a separate account held in your name alone under a small trust James established. The balance at the time of transfer was $61,400. James has been maintaining and growing that account since my death, according to instructions I left him. By now, it should be considerably more. That envelope I've included is for James. He's been waiting for it. There is also the matter of the house on Delwood Road. Eleanor stopped reading. She looked up at the wall of Carol Hensley's office. Pale cream paint. A framed photograph of the cemetery in autumn. She breathed in slowly. She knew Delwood Road. It was a quiet street 12 minutes from Clement Avenue. She had no idea what George meant. She found the answer in the second page. In the spring of 2011, before I knew anything was wrong with my health, I purchased a small rental property at 414 Delwood Road, paid in full, cash, from an account I'd been building for 30 years that I never mentioned because I intended it as a surprise for our retirement. I put the deed in your name only, not a joint deed, yours alone. I left it with James, same as everything else. The house has been renting since 2013. James has a property management firm handling it. The rental income has been going into your trust account every month. I should have told you all of this years ago. I should have sat down with you and shown you the accounts and said, "Here, Eleanor, this is what I built for you. This is what I was saving. This is why I was so careful with money for so long." Instead, I kept it separate because I'm a stubborn, private man, and I thought I had more time to do it properly. Then I found out I didn't have more time, and by then I was more worried about Thomas than about the right moment to tell you about a house. The truth is, I don't know if Thomas will take more from you after I'm gone. I don't know if it was weakness in a hard year or something worse. What I know is that by keeping this separate, by keeping it with James, By keeping it away from any account Thomas has ever seen or touched, I've kept it safe. Whatever he has or hasn't done since I died, he cannot reach this. I love you, Eleanor. I have loved you since 1965, and I will love you across whatever comes after this. Please let James help you now. Please let Philip know you are not alone. And please, when it's time, come lie down next to me. Your George. Eleanor sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. The office was very quiet. Through the window, she could see a groundskeeper moving slowly between rows of headstones, pushing a wheelbarrow, not looking up. She thought about George at the kitchen table in the winter of 2011. She tried to remember if he'd seemed different that season. Worried, perhaps. Quieter than usual. She'd attributed it to age, to the cold, to the natural settling of a long marriage into comfortable silence. She hadn't looked closely enough. Or perhaps she had looked and hadn't wanted to see. She thought about Thomas, about the calls since March. Mom, do you know where the account statements are? About the power of attorney she'd given him 6 years ago, after the small stroke, when she'd been frightened, and he'd been there with forms already prepared, already printed. She'd signed them at her kitchen table, trusting him completely, because he was her firstborn, and that was what mothers did. She folded George's letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and picked up her purse. She called James Whitfield from the car. He answered on the second ring, and when she said her name, he was quiet for just a moment. The silence of a man who has been waiting a very long time for a particular phone call. Eleanor, he said, I'm glad you called. I've been ready for you. They met the following morning in his office. James Whitfield was 71, had been her family's attorney for 30 years, and had the particular quality of a person who has kept a difficult secret with great care and great cost. He looked relieved in a way that went beyond professional courtesy. He spread the documents across his desk, the trust account statements, the Delwood Road deed, 12 years of rental income carefully recorded, the current balance. Eleanor looked at the numbers without speaking for almost a minute. The trust account held $143,000. The property on Delwood Road had a current assessed value of just under $280,000. George, she said quietly, to no one in the room. He was very thorough, James said, and very patient. He asked me to tell you, when the time came, that he was sorry it took him so long to learn how to show you what he was thinking. Eleanor nodded. She looked at the draft will in her folder, the unfinished one, the one that had been sitting in the manila envelope on her kitchen table for 11 days. She placed it on James' desk. I need to change this, she said, completely. James looked at her carefully. How much time do we have? She told him what Dr. Harmon had said. James wrote something on his notepad without changing his expression. I'll have a new draft ready by tomorrow afternoon, he said. We'll execute it as soon as you're satisfied with it. Thomas gets nothing from the trust and nothing from Delwood Road, Eleanor said. Philip gets the house on Clement Avenue and the contents. The trust and the property income go to Philip and to Lily. Lily was Philip's daughter, 19 years old, the grandchild who sent Eleanor handwritten cards on ordinary Tuesdays for no reason other than that she'd been thinking of her. James wrote it all down without comment. On the drive home, Eleanor stopped at Thomas's house. She didn't call ahead. She sat in his driveway for a moment, then went to the door. Thomas answered in a golf shirt, surprised, already composing a smile. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She simply told him, standing on his front step in the April afternoon, that she knew, that she had known for less than 24 hours, but that George had known for much longer, and that she had already spoken to James Whitfield, and that Thomas should also speak to a lawyer if he felt that was appropriate. Then she said she forgave him, because she was dying, and she didn't have the energy for anything else, and also because George had forgiven him too, in his way, by choosing silence over distraction, and she wanted to honor that. Thomas said nothing. He went the color of old ash. The golf shirt, the driveway, the manufactured composure, all of it looked suddenly very thin. Eleanor walked back to her car, She signed the new will on a Thursday, 2 days after meeting with James. Her hand was steady. The witness was Carol Hensley from Riverside Memorial, whom Eleanor had called on an impulse she couldn't quite explain, except that Carol had sat quietly in that office and left the room without being asked, and Eleanor had decided that counted for something. Philip drove her home afterward. He didn't know yet about the will, about Delwood Road, about any of it. Eleanor had told him only that she'd visited the cemetery and that she felt better for having gone. He'd accepted that without pushing, the way Philip accepted most things, with a quietness that reminded her so much of George that it sometimes hurt to look at him directly. On the drive, he asked if she was hungry. A little, she said. He stopped at the diner on Maple where they used to go when he was in high school, where the pie was still exactly as good as it had been in 1989, and the booths were the same cracked red vinyl. They sat across from each other and ate apple pie and drank coffee and talked about Lily, who had just declared a major in environmental science and was furious about something happening to a watershed in the Pacific Northwest. Philip did an impression of her describing it on the phone, all compressed outrage and borrowed vocabulary, and Eleanor laughed. A real laugh, the kind that uses your whole chest, for the first time in weeks. She's remarkable, Eleanor said. She gets it from you, Philip said. Eleanor looked at her son across the table and thought about what she was leaving him. Not just the house on Clement Avenue, not just the practical weight of it, but the knowledge eventually that George had been watching over them in his quiet, stubborn way, building a small fortress out of patience and careful paperwork and the particular love of a man who expressed everything through what he did rather than what he said. Philip would understand that. Philip had always understood that kind of love. She didn't tell him yet. There would be time for James to explain it all properly, after. What mattered now was the pie and the vinyl booth and her son's voice and the way the afternoon light came through the diner window at an angle that made everything look like a photograph you'd want to keep. Eleanor Marsh died on the 25th of April, 3 days after signing the will, in her own bed on Clement Avenue, in the room she and George had shared for 51 years. It was early morning, the dogwood visible through the window, the light just beginning. Philip had stayed the night on the couch downstairs and heard nothing. He brought coffee up at 7 and found her peaceful, her hands folded, her face entirely without struggle. The hospice nurse arrived within the hour and said what hospice nurses say when someone has died this way, in their own home, without pain, at the end of a long life. That it was a good death, as deaths go. Philip sat with her for a long time before he called anyone. Karen arrived within the hour and wept with genuine grief, and Eleanor, had she been able to see it, would have felt no satisfaction in knowing that her daughter's tears were real. Karen had loved her in her organized, managing way, and that was love, even if it wasn't always the kind that felt like warmth. Thomas did not come until the afternoon. James Whitfield met with the three of them the following week in his office, the same office where Eleanor had sat 2 weeks earlier and looked at the numbers without speaking. He read the will in its entirety, clearly, without editorializing. Karen would receive Eleanor's jewelry and the contents of the cedar chest in the upstairs hall. Thomas would receive the dining set and the china, items of modest sentimental value. The house on Clement Avenue and everything else in it went to Philip. The trust account and the rental income from Delwood Road went jointly to Philip and to Lily. Thomas asked James to repeat the section about the trust. James repeated it. "What trust?" Thomas said. "What is Delwood Road?" James explained, briefly and without embellishment, that the trust had been established by George Marsh in 2012, had been maintained in Eleanor's name alone, and had been entirely outside the scope of any power of attorney that Thomas had held. He said this in the tone of a man who has prepared carefully for exactly this conversation and intends to conduct it with complete professional calm. Thomas left without speaking further. The door didn't slam. That, somehow, was worse. Philip stayed behind after Karen had gone. He sat across from James and listened while the attorney explained everything. George's discovery, the winter of 2011, the accountant, the decision to say nothing and protect quietly instead. When James finished, Philip was quiet for a long moment. He never said a word, Philip said. No, James agreed. He didn't. Not to her. Not to anyone. He felt it was the only way to protect her without destroying the family while he was still alive to watch it happen. Whether that was the right choice, that's not mine to say. But he made it for her. Everything he did for her. Philip looked out the window. James watched him and said nothing more, understanding that some things need a moment of silence before they can be carried properly. Does Lily know yet? Philip asked finally. Not yet. That's yours to tell. Lily drove from Columbus the weekend after the funeral. She sat in the kitchen of the house on Clement Avenue, her grandmother's kitchen, the original tile, the window with the dogwood, and Philip told her everything. The trust, the property, George's letter, the cemetery call, the 3 days. Lily listened without interrupting. She was 19 and she had her great-grandmother's habit of going very still when something mattered. When Philip finished, she looked around the kitchen for a long moment. She knew, Lily said. She knew for 3 days and she didn't say anything to us. She just fixed it. That's who she was, Philip said. Lily pressed her palms flat on the kitchen table, the same table where Eleanor had sat with her manila folder and her unfinished will and her oncologist's printout, and looked at the wood grain as if reading something written there. Grandpa built her a hiding place, she said quietly, and she found it right at the end. He left it where he knew she'd look, Philip said, next to him. Lily nodded slowly. Outside, the dogwood moved in a light wind, the late April blooms holding on a little longer than expected. That autumn, Lily transferred to a university in Dayton to finish her degree. She moved into the house on Clement Avenue and planted tomatoes in the backyard, in the same beds that had gone to weeds. The following spring, they came up strong. She sent Philip a photograph of the first one, small, green, just beginning to turn, and he kept it on his phone and looked at it more often than he would have admitted to anyone. Delwood Road remained a rental. The income went into an account Lily used for her tuition, and later, for a small environmental consulting firm she started at 24, that eventually did meaningful work with exactly the kind of watershed she'd been furious about at 19. George Marsh had never met his great-granddaughter. He had, in his careful and particular way, funded her entire future. Thomas never contested the will. His lawyer, apparently, advised against it. At Riverside Memorial, in Section C, under the oak that had split in a storm and grown back stronger, Eleanor Marsh was buried on a Tuesday in late April, in the plot she had reserved in 1987, in the spot beside George that had been waiting for her for 51 years. Carol Hensley was there. Philip and Lily stood together at the graveside. Karen wept quietly. The service was short and plain-spoken, the way Eleanor had wanted it. On the shared headstone that Philip arranged the following month, below both their names and both their dates, he had 4 words carved in the same clean serif font George had chosen for his side decades earlier. He planned for this. It was Lily's idea. Philip had said it was too strange, too private, too much an inside thing that no one passing by would understand. Lily had said that was exactly why it was right, that the people who needed to understand it would understand it, and the people who didn't need to wouldn't have to. She was not wrong. She was, as Eleanor had always said, remarkable.